The story of the Titanic began long before its tragic end. The White Star Line wanted to outdo its rival Cunard. They dreamed of building the largest, most luxurious ships ever seen. This dream led to the Olympic-class liners. The Titanic would be the second of these magnificent vessels. Construction of the Titanic started in 1909 at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. Thousands of workers toiled day and night, using millions of rivets and tons of steel. The ship slowly took shape over 2 years. The Titanic was designed to be unsinkable with 16 watertight compartments. It could stay afloat even if 4 of these flooded, giving people a false sense of security. The Titanic was 882 feet long, 175 feet tall, and weighed 46,328 tons. It could carry 2,435 passengers and 892 crew members. The Titanic was ready to make history, but no one knew what kind of history it would make. The Titanic was more than just a ship. It was a floating palace of luxury and innovation. First-class passengers enjoyed amenities that rivaled the finest hotels on land, including opulent dining rooms, a grand staircase, and even a swimming pool. The ship boasted Turkish baths, a squash court, and a gym. Even second- and third-class accommodations were impressive for their day. Second-class cabins on the Titanic were comparable to first-class on other ships. Third-class passengers had better quarters than they were used to, with access to common rooms and decent meals. The Titanic's technological innovations were just as impressive as its luxuries. It had an advanced electrical system and wireless telegraph. The ship's powerful engines could propel it at speeds up to 24 knots. There were electric elevators, a telephone system, and even electric heaters in some cabins. Safety features were also a priority in the Titanic's design. The ship had a double-bottomed hull and watertight bulkheads. The Titanic carried more lifeboats than legally required at the time, but these were still not enough for all passengers and crew. This oversight would have tragic consequences later. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic began its maiden voyage from Southampton, England. The docks were crowded with spectators and well-wishers. Passengers boarded the ship, excited for the journey ahead. The Titanic's departure was a grand spectacle. The ship's first stop was Cherbourg, France, where more passengers came aboard, including some of the wealthiest people in the world. The next day, the Titanic made its final stop in Queenstown, Ireland. As the Titanic set out across the Atlantic, life on board settled into a routine. First-class passengers enjoyed lavish meals and entertainment. Second- and third-class passengers found their own ways to pass the time. Many were immigrants, dreaming of a new life in America. Captain Edward Smith, on his final voyage before retirement, commanded the vessel. The mood on board was one of excitement and anticipation. No one could have imagined the fate that awaited them in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic sailed through calm seas. Despite warnings of ice in the area, the ship maintained its high speed. Captain Smith had retired for the night, leaving First Officer William Murdoch in charge. At 11:40 p.m., lookout. Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg ahead. He rang the warning bell and called out, "Iceberg right ahead!" Murdoch ordered the ship to turn and the engines to reverse, but it was too late. The Titanic's starboard side scraped against the iceberg. The collision lasted only about 10 seconds. At first, few passengers noticed anything amiss. Below the waterline, however, the situation was dire. The iceberg had created a series of punctures along the ship's side, and water began pouring into 6 of the watertight compartments. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, quickly assessed the damage and reported to Captain Smith that the Titanic would sink. It was only a matter of hours. The unsinkable ship was doomed, and the race to save lives began. As the reality of the situation became clear, chaos began to unfold. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be prepared and told the wireless operators to send distress signals. The ship's band was instructed to play on deck to keep passengers calm. At first, many passengers were reluctant to leave the Titanic for small lifeboats. The evacuation was disorganized and slow, with some lifeboats launched half-empty. The crew had never practiced a full-scale evacuation and weren't sure how many people each boat could hold. As the ship began to tilt, panic set in. Passengers scrambled for the remaining lifeboats, and the crew struggled to maintain order. Some acts of selflessness emerged amid the chaos. The ship's band continued to play, trying to calm the passengers. Crew members worked tirelessly to help passengers into lifeboats. In the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sent out continuous distress calls. Several ships received their calls, including the Carpathia, which would race to the scene but was hours away. Time was running out for those still aboard the sinking Titanic. As the evacuation continued, a clear protocol emerged: women and children first. Officers interpreted this rule differently. Some allowed men to board if no women or children were nearby, while others strictly prohibited men. Families were torn apart, with husbands saying goodbye to wives and children. The Strauss couple chose to stay together. Third-class passengers faced challenges reaching the lifeboats. By the time they made it, many lifeboats had already left. The situation became desperate as the last lifeboats were launched. The Titanic's stern was rising, and people realized not everyone would survive. As the last lifeboat pulled away, the Titanic's fate was sealed. The ship's lights flickered and went out, and the stern rose higher into the air. People clung to whatever they could, with some jumping into the freezing water. The ship's structure couldn't withstand the stress, and a loud crack was heard as the Titanic split in two. The stern section briefly righted itself before it, too, began to sink. Passengers and crew members fought for their lives in the icy water, with most succumbing to hypothermia within minutes. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves. The sea was now littered with debris and struggling survivors. Cries for help filled the air, and those in lifeboats faced a difficult decision. Should they go back to help? Many feared being swamped by desperate swimmers. Only one lifeboat returned to search for survivors. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe had transferred passengers between boats to free up space. He found only a handful of people still alive in the water. The great Titanic, once thought unsinkable, now lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. In the aftermath of the sinking, stories of heroism and tragedy emerged. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, played until the very end, giving their lives to comfort others. Captain Smith went down with his ship, last seen on the bridge. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was last seen in the first-class smoking room, awaiting his fate. Some passengers showed extraordinary courage. Molly Brown helped row her lifeboat and argued for returning to search for survivors. She would later become known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Ida Strauss refused to leave her husband Isidore, and they were last seen sitting together on deck chairs. There were also tales of cowardice and controversy. White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay was criticized for surviving while so many others perished. The women and children first policy meant that many men, regardless of class, went down with the ship. For those in the lifeboats, the night seemed endless as they huddled together for warmth. After the Titanic went under, they heard the cries of those in the water, which gradually faded as hypothermia claimed more lives. As dawn broke on April 15th, the Carpathia arrived at the disaster site. Captain Arthur Rostron had pushed his ship to its limits, navigating through ice fields to reach the Titanic's last known position. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking. Lifeboats bobbed in the calm sea, surrounded by debris and bodies. The Carpathia's crew worked tirelessly to rescue the Titanic's survivors. They used rope ladders, slings, and even cargo nets to bring people aboard. Many survivors were suffering from hypothermia and shock. The Carpathia's passengers gave up their cabins and donated clothes to help the rescued. As the rescue operation continued, it became clear how few had survived. Of the 2,224 passengers and crew on the Titanic, only 705 were saved. The Carpathia remained in the area for several hours, searching for more survivors, but none were found. Finally, Captain Rostron made the difficult decision to head for New York, carrying the burden of informing the world about the tragedy. As news of the Titanic's sinking spread, the world reacted with shock and disbelief. When the Carpathia docked, it was met by grieving relatives and curious onlookers. Survivors' accounts painted a picture of the disaster. Inquiries were launched in the United States and Britain. Key issues were the shortage of lifeboats and the ship's speed. The investigations led to significant changes in maritime law. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was established in 1914. It required 24-hour radio watch and an international ice patrol. The disaster had personal consequences. with many families losing their primary breadwinners. The Titanic's legacy extends far beyond its sinking. It symbolizes human ambition and the dangers of hubris, retold in books, films, and documentaries. James Cameron's 1997 film brought the story to a new generation. The 1985 discovery reignited interest. Expeditions provided new insights, raised ethical questions about salvaging artifacts. The deteriorating wreck is a poignant reminder. The Titanic continues to fascinate people worldwide.